So welcome to our Filipino American history before 1904 overview. My name is Sydney Champagne, and we're going to go through a couple of units for you. Filipino Americans have a rich and diverse history. However, many school curriculums do not reflect this. The following lesson plans will introduce students and teachers to the centuries-long foundational role that Filipinos have had in American history. This unit will introduce the following themes: exploitation, migration, assimilation, colonialism, internalized oppression, colonial mentality, manifest destiny, globalization, and more. By the end of this unit, students will be able to identify how America's treatment of Filipino peoples affected communities both in the United States and the Philippines, articulate the varied roles early Filipino Americans played in America's history, and evaluate the ways in which this history was either erased, masked, or misconstrued, and its modern day effects.
Hello, my name is Colin Edner, and my unit is all about the Manila galleons. For those unaware, the Manila galleons were a set of ships that, between the years of 1565 and 1850, worked on a trade route between the Filipino city of Manila and the Spanish colony of New Spain, which is what is now called Mexico. You see, during this time, the Philippines were an important Spanish colony due to their strategic place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where merchants from China came to trade Chinese luxury goods, which the Manila galleons would then take on a perilous journey to the New World, so that these goods, oftentimes spices and silks, could be traded for Mexican silver. These galleons brought a lot of prosperity to Spain, but they did so by exploiting the native populace, who were often impressed into working for little to no pay in shipbuilding yards and on the ships themselves. You see, by impressing these people, Spain had a reliable source of cheap labor who oftentimes were pretty much the only people on board except for a few Spanish overseers. The conditions were so terrible, with very little food and a high chance of dying from severe storms, that upon arriving in the New World, many Filipinos jumped ship and decided to create new lives for themselves in the Americas, wherein they created new communities such as St. Malo. By learning about this little-known aspect of Filipino American history, students will gain a better understanding of how imperialism and globalization have shaped Filipino American culture.
Thank you so much, Colin. You have set the stage for the next unit. My name is Rebecca Bonilla, and I would like to speak about St. Malo, Louisiana. The Spaniards obviously colonized the Philippines. They recruited Filipino men to take part of the Manila galleon global trade, which connected the Asian, Americas, and European economies. The Spanish called the Filipino men Lucianos Indios. This meant Filipino sailors that were among the crew of galleon. And in one of those famous and successful voyages, the Spaniards and the Manila men were in Louisiana because of trade. And in the midst of unloading cargo, Filipino sailors jumped ship and swam towards the cypress swamp in St. Malo. You would expect that the Spanish sailors would go after them, but they didn't even bother to do so because the swamp was filled with gators, and they were too afraid to be eaten alive. And of course, the Manila men who actually survived lived very successfully in this village and also thrived in the community. Matter of fact, Hearns, a journalist who documented his experience in this environment, described the fishing village as a thriving community of house built on stilts, similar to countless floating communities in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. All are built in true Manila style, with immersed hat-shaped eaves and balconies, but in wood. The Tagalog community impacted and became a great part of the American culture. Matter of fact, they even revived the once dying practice of farming shrimp. In addition to being a part of the farming fish industry, they also became a part of the Battle of the New Orleans in 1814. According to historian Marina España, it has been long suspected, but never confirmed, that many of these so-called pirates were Manila men. They were described as Spanish fishermen from the Lake Boers area. They only knew Spanish-speaking fishermen living in the region at the time, and they were Manila men. I believe that the overarching themes in this unit are colonization, assimilation, and cultural influence. Questions that you guys should be answering throughout this unit and having your students question as well is, how did the Manila men get to St. Malo, Louisiana? And why is it important to understand the cultural impact that the Filipinos had when they arrived to Louisiana? It is important for students and teachers to understand the Asian community and their history. It's a shame to see that the American educational system has yet to go over such pivotal parts of their history. It would be important and a necessity for us to go over the Filipino culture.
Thank you, Rebecca. My name is Allison Fishbach, and I'm going to talk about our third lesson, which jumps forward in time a little bit. It's about Ramon Reyes Leyla. He is the author of the 1898 book, The Philippine Islands, and that is the first English language book about the Philippines. Leyla himself is a complex case study of internalized oppression. During his life, he presented himself as a native Filipino with European schooling, but the reality was that he was ethnically Indian. He was raised in Manila before moving to the United States. He leveraged his knowledge of the Philippines to satisfy the growing American curiosity for the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War. But while doing so, he presented a false picture not only of himself, but of other Filipinos, presenting the Philippines as a nation that desired US control. On the screen, you can see some of the essential questions in this lesson that touch on the unit as a whole. And some of the keywords we want students to learn are things like internalized oppression, exploitation, and American exceptionalism. This unit really wants students to realize that colonialism is not only an outward force, but an inward one. In exploring Leyla's work in life, there is very little secondary source scholarship, which pushes students towards developing their own conclusions from primary source documents. This lesson leverages those documents as a practice in critical thinking and discerning motives through reflection and personal experience. It also asks students to engage with complex histories and develop arguments that interact with the voices of historical figures, and to see history from the viewpoint of the oppressed. One of the highlights of this lesson is an activity that asks students to form connections between Leyla's arguments for Philippine statehood and US occupation and current debates about Puerto Rican statehood. This lesson shows students that history is not in the past, but has a direct bearing on the world that they live in today.
Hi, my name is Mary Claire Price, and I'll be talking about Unit 4, the Philippine American War. It was fought between 1899 and 1902 and was a conflict born out of the US victory of the Spanish-American War. Its resulting 1898 Treaty of Paris saw Spain hand over several colonies to America, including the Philippines. However, during the shift in power between Spain and the US, the main Filipino revolutionary group, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, saw a potential power vacuum in which to start establishing their autonomy. They resisted the American troops, who started slowly forcing their way into the Philippines, or what the US now consider their own property. The Philippine American War is just one instance of American intervention, however. The US has, throughout history, implanted itself in foreign politics under the guise of salvation from the barbarism of primitive cultures. Students should understand how these motivations are advertised as altruistic, but are undertaken solely as imperialistic measures to further American sovereignty. It's essential to teach our youth that these anti-Asian perspectives are grounded in aggressive, colonialist attitudes that reflect the worst sides of history. We can see today how important it is to educate ourselves about these histories and understand how these beliefs held circa 1900 still inform parts of the public consciousness in America today. It is also critical that Asian perspectives from a wider array of countries across the Asian continent, such as the Philippines, are represented and discussed within our classrooms and our larger society. So on the left, we see a photograph of Filipino soldiers, and on the right is an illustration by George W. Peters that was published in the American magazine Leslie's Weekly called Leading the Troops in Santa Cruz.
Unit number 4 covers the Philippine Exhibition at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. This was the largest World's Fair ever held. It was held to commemorate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, to show off new technologies, and to highlight American exceptionalism. The Philippine Exhibition was the largest at the fair. It covered 47 acres of replica villages, housing, fishing vessels, and gathering places. Most notably, the Philippine Exhibition was the temporary home of 1,100 Filipino men, women, and children who were featured as a curiosity to the white Western gaze. The most popular exhibit were the Igorot people, who were seen as the least civilized and most alien to Westerners. These human zoos distorted the reality of life in the Philippines by making it a spectacle for people unfamiliar with their culture. This distortion echoes through history and persists to this day. Some of the essential questions for this unit are: how did the Philippine Exposition serve American colonial goals? What are the lingering effects of this kind of colonization? And where does sharing one's culture end and exploitation begin? These units prompt a variety of questions. How do the absences of these histories lead to misinformation, prejudice, and aggression? How does colonialism affect its subjects? These units will fill in some of these historical absences and offer students a new lens through which to understand American history. Thank you for learning with us today.